So today I'm going to be finishing up the Kingston and Carter lecture that last night I couldn't finish because there was a termite storm, so I couldn't have lights on. Okay, so I think where we left off with the Carter was in the last kind of like preliminary like wolf lore, where the man runs away from his marriage and becomes a wolf, or maybe doesn't do it on purpose, and then he returns and asks his wife for some cabbage, and then her new husband beats her after she cries when he's killed. So the main story is based on Little Red Riding Hood, and what Angela Carter does really well and does in a lot of her work, not just this story, is she will take fairy tales and like recast them and reinvent them so that women have the power in the fairy tale. So obviously in like our normal story of Little Red Riding Hood, we have this little girl, and she's like going through the woods to visit her grandmother, and she doesn't listen to her mom, and the wolf comes and eats her grandmother. So in that story, it's like terrifying for her, and she has no real power at all. Little Red Riding Hood is just like a scared little girl in the woods. In this story, she's never named as Little Red Riding Hood, but our version of her is someone with agency, someone who even before she gets to her grandmother's house and like finds herself in the situation where the wolf man is going to kill her, even before that she has very clear agency, and her agency in particular is sexual. And throughout the book this comes from, this is from a book called The Bloody Chamber, and it's based on like a bunch of different fairy tales. I think most of them are by Charles Perrault. I know this one is, I know Bluebeard is, and that's the one that the title comes from, I'm pretty sure. So it's just a book of reimagined fairy tales, and it's really good. Like, I would definitely recommend it if you liked this story. So on page 1223, we shift into that main story. Our last sentence from the sort of previous like tales or whatever is before he can become a wolf, the lycanthrope strips stark naked. If you spy a naked man among the pines, you must run as if the devil were after you. Which I think is a really interesting sentence, because I think a real undercurrent to this story is the way in which men in particular are like violent and dangerous, and sex itself in this story is really associated with violence. So on the one hand, like if you see a naked man among the pines, you need to run because he might be a wolf, but I think there's also like the, you know, maybe you should just run anyway because the naked man himself might be as dangerous as the wolf. So interesting. And because in this first part of the story, like all the men are so like dangerous and violent, I think that we really imagine that something terrible is going to happen to like Red Riding Hood in this story. And it doesn't, right? This kind of subverts our expectations. So she goes to the woods, and there's this real emphasis on the power of her virginity. So on page 1224, in the middle, she stands and moves within the invisible pentacle of her own virginity. She is an unbroken egg. She is a sealed vessel. She has inside her a magic space, the entrance to which is shut tight with a plug of membrane. She is a closed system. She does not know how to shiver. She has her knife, and she is afraid of nothing. So I think this is a really interesting characterization of virginity, because normally virginity is culturally constructed as this state in which a woman is still a girl, and like she's innocent and pure, all this, you know, sort of stuff. We don't generally imagine a virgin girl as like holding a knife and afraid of nothing, right? So in a way, her virginity actually makes her like powerful and dangerous, and I think the reason it does that is because she's aware of the power it gives her over men, because virginity is ultimately like a cultural construct for women that says that like you can only be made a woman, like an adult, by being penetrated by a man. And there's like physical evidence generally when that happens, right, of like blood. So it's kind of this marker of womanhood. And I think that Carter is critiquing that a bit because, I mean, I don't know, I feel like the critique of that is kind of obvious, right? That like your womanhood depends on like a man having sex with you. And in critiquing it, she kind of shows how like the only reason virginity would be powerful is because of the way that men imagine it to be, maybe. So I think that's interesting. She walks into the forest, and the forest closed upon her like a pair of jaws. So there's definitely like a motif throughout this story of teeth and mouths, which I think makes a lot of sense because this story does conflate sex and violence so much. And teeth, on the one hand, like if you're a wolf, teeth are like, I mean, you know, like they're wolf teeth, like they're dangerous. They're like what wolves use to tear flesh. But the mouth is also like a central part of like the sex act, right? And we know that like the bet that this huntsman makes with Riding Hood is that if he beats her there, she has to kiss him. So when we meet the huntsman, there is again emphasis on his teeth, right? She had her hand on her knife at the first rustle of twigs, but he laughed with a flash of white teeth when he saw her and made a comic yet flattering little bow. And then later, he laughed at her again, gleaming trails of spittle clung to his teeth. So there's a lot of teeth in this story, and I think that really like foreshadows like what he's going to transform into, right? So even if you've somehow like never read this fairy tale or never heard this fairy tale before, I think like the fact that she's in the forest, it closed upon her like a pair of jaws, and the emphasis on his like glistening teeth really gives us this like spooky sense that he's going to turn into some kind of like wolf and that he's dangerous. Okay. And I don't know if we ever went over foreshadowing in this class, but it's just when someone like in fiction writes something that gives you a hint of what's going to happen later in the story. Okay. And so when he gets to the grandmother's house, he is snacking on his catch, which is horrifying because he's still a human. He's just like eating raw meat with like the blood dripping down his chin. And then he kills the grandmother, right? And this is where we get to kind of like the famous part of Little Red Riding Hood of like, you know, my, what big like teeth you have, all the better to eat you with, that whole thing. I think what big eyes you have. I think she says it about a bunch of different things. And there's a bit of a play here on page 1226 when he takes his pants off. And we're told his genitals are huge. And it's emphasized. So his genitals, huge. Huge on page 1226. So you can kind of think of this with like, you know, what big you have. And so this really like explicitly associates the wolf with like not only violence but also sex. And we know that like this girl is still on her way to the cabin where she will collect her kiss, I guess, or he will collect his kiss from her. Okay, let's see what else. So when Riding Hood gets there, we obviously are worried, you know, we expect her to probably die or something. And she knows that she's in danger of death, right? So on the bottom of 1226, She sees her grandmother's hair in the fireplace, and when the girl saw that, she knew she was in danger of death. "Where is my grandmother? There's nobody here but we two, my darling." And then howling starts happening, and I think it's really cool how the outside wolves like mirror what's going on in the house by what kind of songs they're singing. So on 1227, at first we're told, "She closed the window on the wolves' threnody." And a threnody, as our footnote tells us, is a song of lamentation for the dead. And so these wolves outside are like mourning the death of the grandmother, in a way making them more, innocent than the half wolf, half man who's inside the house. So that kind of suggests to us that the beastliness is within his nature as a human, not necessarily within his nature as a wolf. And then she starts undressing. They both start undressing, and her shawl, the redness of her shawl, is very explicitly linked to the color of poppies, the color of sacrifices, the color of her menses, and she ceases to be afraid. So her menstrual blood is like this other motif that keeps coming back through the story. So there's, on the one hand, like the blood of like the wolf's kill, and the grandmother, we can assume there's just this blood of death. And then there's also the blood of menstruation, which is another mark for cis women of like their entrance into womanhood and fertility. And then the wolves start howling a prothalamion. So a prothalamion is a song before marriage. So they shift from mourning the grandmother to celebrating the union of the wolf and the girl. And he threatens her, but she burst out laughing. She, quote, "She knew she was nobody's meat." At the bottom of this page. Okay. So by the end of the story, she has tamed the wolf. So it ends with, "See, sweet and sound she sleeps in Granny's bed between the paws of the tender wolf." So through her own transformation from girl to woman, and from not a virgin, from virgin to like sexually active being, this girl is able to also transform the wolf. And oddly, it seems, I mean, we don't have like a perfect like description of what he looks like at every moment, but I'm pretty sure that he is a man when she gets there, and in taming him, she makes him a wolf. So again, this idea that like his wildness and his beastly nature is his human nature, and his nature as a man, and in taming him and making him like be calm, she turns him into a wolf. So this transformation of girl to woman is mirrored in the transformation of man to wolf. And that's why the story emphasizes wedding night so much, as I said in the last lecture, because that's when women traditionally lost their virginity. And in turning this fairy tale into a really like erotic story, Carter draws attention to the way that our culture fetishizes and sexualizes young women. So again, like that obsession with virginity, and the way in which virginity has like historically been constructed as something really like desirable and hot, is ultimately just like a fetishization of youth, right, and of inexperience, and of like just a woman who has never, I guess, who's innocent. And so again, like part of Carter's choice here to arm the virgin and give her like no fear, sort of subverts the way that virginity is normally constructed in our culture. Okay, so I hope that is helpful and interesting for you. So now we're going to talk about Kingston's no-name woman. Okay, so Maxine Kingston is the daughter of Chinese immigrants who operated a laundry in Stockton, California. And in this book, which is called The Woman Warrior, She writes like all these different stories of her family and of her, I guess it's like her family's history. And this is a memoir, which means it's a collection of memories that she wrote about her own life. So that means it's true, right? Like it's not a story, it's like it's a true account, or it's at least a true story. But it's complicated by the fact that she doesn't know the real story, right? So although it's a memoir, she can't, she's not claiming that it's the truth, because she makes it very clear from the beginning that this story of this no-name woman has never been told to her, so she has to invent the details. So I think that's an interesting choice on her part, right? To like write this, true story, write a memoir, and include things in it that she can't know whether or not they were true. And it's just basically up to her to like cast them as the truth. So the story begins with the sentence, "You must not tell anyone, my mother said, what I am about to tell you." So right away, a very ironic opening, because if she was going to not tell anybody, she probably wouldn't have put it in a book that got super famous and anthologized. So she takes this story that has been, that has never really been spoken, and the reason it's never been spoken is to punish the aunt. She takes it and she like speaks the story in order to dignify her aunt in the afterlife in a way. Okay. So for Kingston, the aunt's life is determined not by her own actions, but by the way her story is told or not told. So in this way, she is affirming the power of language and the necessity of telling the stories of forgotten women. And that's basically like, I think sort of her goal with this story is to give name and like, not name, but to give a story to this woman whose story was erased. So there's a lot of good stuff going on in this story. So her mother tells it to her as a cautionary tale, right? So she tells it to her on page 30. She says, "Don't let your father know what I told you. He denies her. Now that you have started to menstruate, what happened to her could happen to you. Don't humiliate us. You wouldn't like to be forgotten as if you had never been born. The villagers are watchful." So her mother is pretty explicitly saying to her, like, being an adult woman is dangerous, right? Like, your body, from when you menstruate until, like, menopause, is almost like a I don't know how exactly to say it. Like, it's not really like a ticking time bomb, but like it's something that like you're not totally in control of anymore, and something that other people have agency over. Like, that's what her mother is saying. Like, it's not about you. It's about us. Don't humiliate us. The villagers are watchful. And what the villagers did to the aunt was very, like, the way it's written here is very clearly like a symbolic destruction of her role as a woman. So again, on page 1230, this is how their destruction of the aunt's house is described. The villagers pushed through both wings, even your grandparents' rooms, to find your aunt's, which was also mine until the men returned. From this room, a new wing for one of the younger families would grow. They ripped up her clothes and shoes and broke her combs, grinding them underfoot. They tore her work from the loom. They scattered the cooking fire and rolled the new weaving in it. We could hear them in the kitchen breaking our bowls and banging the pots. They overturned the great waist-high earthenware jugs. Duck eggs, pickled fruits, vegetables burst out and mixed in acrid torrents. The old woman from the next field swept a broom through the air and loosed the spirits of the broom over our heads. Pig, ghost, pig, they sobbed and scolded while they ruined our house. So the stuff they're ruining is stuff that, like, women, traditionally would have would have done, right? Like they would have pickled all that stuff. She would have like worked on the loom, done this weaving. She would have built the cooking fire. So symbolically, they're saying like you are no longer a woman. Like your status as a woman is destroyed through the fact that you got pregnant. Like that's what the villagers are saying to her. And so then on 1231, Kingston kind of like is thinking through like why her mother told these stories and like what they meant. And I really like this passage at the top of the page. Chinese Americans, she says here, Chinese Americans, when you try to understand what things in you are Chinese, how do you separate what is peculiar to childhood, to poverty, insanities, one family, your mother who marked you growing with stories, from what is Chinese? What is Chinese tradition and what is the movies? And so she says she can't really ask, right? Because the story was told as a warning, but like her father doesn't even acknowledge that he ever had a sister. So she can't ask about it. And this story, and I think like the rest of this book too, is sort of Kingston coming to terms with, or sort of exploring like this very question, right? Like what is her family history? What is specific to her family, and what can she take as like a larger like cultural inheritance from like what is, you know, Chinese in general. And she can't really know that, right? Like maybe this was just the one village, you know? Okay, so in her first imagining, so then she starts imagining all the different scenarios of how the aunt could have gotten pregnant. And that does make this a little bit confusing, I think, because there's no, like, it's not like a clear, like, start to finish narrative. And instead we have to kind of follow Kingston's like musings of, well, maybe this happened, maybe this happened, maybe this happened. So the first thing she imagines is that she was raped, right? And if she was raped or coerced, Kingston makes it very clear that the situation would have been exactly the same, right? Like she would have still gotten blamed for it. And then after that, on 1233 and onward, Kingston starts imagining that maybe the aunt had agency, right? Like maybe she was a woman with her own like sexual power, doing what she wanted, like despite the fact that it would have been, not acceptable in their village. And so the two like sort of cultural things that are clashing in the story once she starts imagining her aunt as having agency is the collectivism of traditional like old Chinese culture and the individualism that would have been necessary for her aunt to say like, I'm gonna brush my hair and like look good and like, you know, basically do these things to distinguish myself as an individual in order to like get with this guy. Yeah, so vanity is obviously useless to the collective. Like there's no reason, you know, if you're only looking out for the good of like the family unit or the village, you looking individually hot isn't really gonna like help with that. So for example, we're told at the top of 1233 that all the married women blunt cut their hair in flaps about their ears or pulled it back in tight buns. No nonsense. Neither style blew easily into heart-catching tangles, and at their weddings they displayed themselves in their long hair for the last time. So women aren't meant to be like beautiful or like sexually desirable in their appearance in this like old village culture that the aunt is coming from. But Kingston imagines that the aunt goes against that, right? And decides to, you know, look good. And I think that that kind of possible tension between the aunt's potential vanity and the sort of collective, like, I don't know, I guess like resistance of vanity, or like not, I don't know, eschewing of vanity, that's the word, kind of mirrors the way that Kingston herself feels this tension between what she calls American feminine and Chinese feminine that she herself was trying to like navigate as a kid in school. So she says, she basically is doing something similar to what they did in the village, where no one was, so also the reason that nobody in this village was allowed to like just have like promiscuous sex with anybody else that they wanted was because everybody was related. So there were like these arranged marriages that were like specifically chosen so that people would not marry someone and not have sex with someone that they were related to, because it was just like a small population. And so Kingston says she even finds herself doing this in school. So at the bottom of 1234, as if it came from an atavism deeper than fear, I used to add brother silently to boys' names. It hexed the boys who would or would not ask me to dance, and made them less scary and as familiar and deserving of benevolence as girls. But of course I hexed myself also. No dates. I should have stood up, both arms waving, and shouted out across libraries, "Hey you, love me back." I had no idea, though, how to make attraction selective, how to control its direction and magnitude. If I made myself American pretty so that the 5 or 6 Chinese boys in the class fell in love with me, everyone else, the Caucasian, Negro, and Japanese boys, would too. Sisterliness, dignified and honorable, made much more sense. And then she says, attractiveness eludes control so stubbornly that whole societies designed to organize relationships among people cannot keep order, not even when they bind people to one another from childhood and raise them together, which I think is really interesting. So a big sort of theme in this story, I guess, is like the way in which we try to control and shape attraction, and the way that we try to like control desire and sex. And Kingston ultimately wants to imagine that her aunt is someone who rebels against this. Let's see. So as I said, in Old World China was a place where everything was done for the good of the collective, the family, or the village. And so her aunt endangered the social order by giving into her private lust. On the same page, on 1235, she talks about the roundness of Chinese, of like old Chinese village society. So everyone in the village is connected and responsible for one another. And the aunt like breaks this roundness by going out on her own and like doing what she wants, right? So ultimately, Kingston decides that her aunt chose her fate, right? Because what happened to her is the same no matter what, and it would have been the same no matter what, whether she was raped or whether she decided, like, you know, I am in love with this guy and I'm gonna have sex with him, or whether she just wanted to have sex with some dude. No matter what happened, she would have been punished. So Kingston decides that in telling her story and retelling her story in a way that's not just like a warning from her mother, but rather, you know, it's this version of the story, she decides that she's going to retell it in a way that gives this woman sexual power and just gives her general agency over herself. So just like how Carter rewrites the Little Red Riding Hood in order to give Riding Hood power, this story gives the nameless aunt power. So even at the end, in this really like tragic, you know, imagining of her last moments where she jumps into the well with the baby, Kingston writes at the bottom of 1236, carrying the baby to the well shows loving, otherwise abandon it, turn its face in the mud. Mothers who love their children take them along. It was probably a girl. There is some hope of forgiveness for boys. So there's obviously like a strong critique as well of the way women are treated in like traditional Chinese society. Her mother tells her, you know, how lucky she is not to have her feet bound, and she imagines that the baby was like a girl because if it was a boy, maybe the child could have had some kind of life, but a girl who was born of this like illegitimate union is never going to be forgiven by the village. And so the mother doesn't kill her necessarily like out of rage or spite or whatever. Like she feels that she's, or I think we're meant to assume that she feels that she is saving her daughter from like a horrible fate by taking her life and taking her in the well. So in the end, Kingston talks a little bit about silence. So she says, I have thought that my family, having settled among immigrants who had also been their neighbors in the ancestral land, needed to clean their name, and a wrong word would incite the kinspeople even here. But there is more to this silence. They want me to participate in her punishment, and I have. Her betrayal so maddened them, they saw to it that she would suffer forever, even after death. So, always hungry, always needing, she would have to beg food from other ghosts, snatch and steal it from those whose living descendants give them gifts. So, Kingston is saying, like, she gets no offers from the living, so she's like a hungry ghost. And by not telling her story, Kingston realizes she has participated in her punishment. And so to make that right, she retells the story and tells it in a way that gives the aunt some power and I guess like immortalizes her and maybe gets rid of some of that shame and some of that silence, because ultimately like silence breeds shame, right? Like the things we don't talk about are the things that we're ashamed of, and that's why people like say, you should talk about mental illness, right? Because like if you don't talk about it, it becomes something shameful and then people suffer. So in this same way, by breaking the silence, Kingston is I guess hoping that she can alleviate this shame. Okay, so I think that's it for these last two stories. We did not get to the Gwen Harwood, so sorry, it won't be on the exam. You don't have to worry about that. So for the exam, hang on one second. So our last exam had a lot of stuff on it. We really haven't done that much between these two exams. So I think this one will have, should have Catherine Mansfield, Gwendolyn Brooks, but the only poem we got to was The Rites for Cousin Vit, Ujaru New Knuckle, Angela Carter, and Maxine Hung Kingston. So there's really not going to be that much on it in terms of where the passages are coming from. And with the terms, there might be terms from like the rest of the semester too, and I would definitely also take notes on the lecture I gave you about like contemporary literature. So like some possible terms would be, what did we talk about today? It was foreshadowing, fairy tales, memoir, those could be on there. Let's see. We talked a lot about like Australian colonization and Aboriginal history, so that stuff could be on there. The Aboriginal worldview, which is called the dreaming, that might be on there. Pacification by force, that was a policy of genocide. Let's see. It's from the wrong class. Okay. So we talked a lot about the idea of the woman as muse, so just know that the muse is something that like inspires art, and traditionally refers to these like sisters in Greek and Roman myth who were beautiful women who inspired men to write. Let's see. McCarthyism, we talked about new criticism, talked about blacklisting during the Cold War, we talked a bit about existentialism, not too much. Yeah, so, okay. And also, I think this would also have How It Feels to Be Colored Me on it, but not Sweat. So Sweat was on the last exam. How It Feels to Be Colored Me by Zora Neale Hurston will be on this exam instead. So yeah, Harlem Renaissance might be on here. I think that was on the last one too, but you know, still relevant. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helps you. Definitely, like, you know, British colonialism, that might be something you want to know about. Rosie the Riveter, I'm not sure if we actually went over that. Equal Pay Act of 1963, Roe versus Wade, this could be on there. Yeah, so just make sure that you are reading that. All those terms I just said also came from the section later 20th century and contemporary literature, so you can go over that if you want. But I think that ought to be it. So hopefully you guys are feeling okay about the exam. If you have questions, you can always email me. But also, like, please read my emails and stuff before you email me questions, because I'm behind on like other work, because like the email situation's just like getting out of control. It's not your fault, obviously. It's just like a bad format for teaching that we're all stuck in right now. So yeah, it's been a great semester. I really wish I could have seen you guys in person for the rest of it. You were a really great class, and I'm really glad I got to take it over. I had a great time, and I hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe. And you're always welcome to come visit me in my office, 321, when the world goes back to normal-ish, which I hope it does by the fall. So have a great summer, and let me know if you need anything. Bye.